He didn't speak, not even when the boy laughed, loud and careless, across the linoleum floor of the diner. Didn't flinch when the phone came out to snap a picture of the old geezer in the war hat, as the teen later captioned it. Walter Givens just sat there, his spine upright but tired, hands folded over a coffee mug that had long gone cold, the rim chipped like the bones in his knuckles. He had been coming to this same booth every Sunday for 17 years, always at 7:30 a.m., always alone, always wearing that hat, the one with the faded 82nd Airborne patch stitched above the brim, and the name W. Givens written faintly in ink beneath it. And that morning, it should have been just like all the others, until a teenager in a hoodie with more attitude than understanding leaned over the back of the booth and snorted, "But that hat's older than you are, Grandpa." Museums down the street. The entire diner went quiet, the kind of silence that tastes metallic and awkward, the kind that remembers shame before anyone speaks it out loud. And Walter? Walter didn't rise to it. He just slowly looked up, eyes a little watery from age, but sharp enough to still cut through pretense, and said nothing at all. But the man sitting with the teenager, that was where the shift began. Because the teen's father, Daniel Mercer, hadn't noticed much of the exchange until then. Had buried in emails, fingers tapping an untouched coffee, too busy being important to realize his son had just spat on something far more meaningful than rank. But something in Walter's gaze, steady, tired, and infinitely patient, made Daniel turn his head fully, like he was waking up from some long corporate sleep. "Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe honor doesn't retire, if you still think a veteran deserves dignity no matter how many years have passed, then like and subscribe. Because what happens next is about more than just a hat and a laugh. It's about how silence can be stronger than shouting, and how sometimes the real lesson isn't taught by the father, but to him." That morning didn't begin with disrespect, though. It began with Walter at his apartment, hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his collar in the mirror, brushing invisible dust off his best shirt. His fingers lingered on a small photo taped beside the frame, 3 men in jump gear, all smiles, all ghosts now. Then came the careful polishing of his boots, the folding of a napkin for his pocket, and finally the tap of his cane as he left the apartment, pausing only to check that the small shadow box above his fireplace was still sealed tight. No one had ever opened it. Not the landlady. Not the health aide. Not even the curious neighbor who sometimes brought Walter a slice of pie. Inside it, behind the glass, was a letter signed by a general, yellowed and shaking gently against metals most people had never seen, metals earned in a forest clearing outside Corinton, in a sky over Holland, and in a prison camp Walter never talked about. But he didn't take the box with him. He just nodded at it, like a ritual, and left it untouched, like always. When he reached the diner, the regulars offered him a respectful nod, and the waitress poured his coffee without asking. He wrote in a small notebook while the world moved on around him. But when that laugh cracked across the air, when the teen leaned in, grinning as if the moment were a joke worth posting, that's when everything paused. And yet Walter didn't protest, didn't correct him. He had no one left to defend his name to. The boy's father, however, did. Because Daniel Mercer, financial analyst, keynote speaker, divorce-free years and drifting fast, looked up and saw in that moment exactly who his son had become. And worse, who he hadn't. He told Blake to stand up. Blake rolled his eyes. "Dad, come on. It's just a hat." But Daniel's voice came out flat and unfamiliar. "Outside. Now." What no one at the diner knew, what even Walter didn't know, is that Daniel's grandfather had worn a very similar hat, had landed in Normandy, had taught Daniel how to treat people, not titles. And right there, in that moment, Daniel realized he had failed, not just in letting his son laugh, but in forgetting where his own reverence had come from. Outside, Daniel didn't yell. He told Blake a story about a man named Jack Mercer who died before Blake was born but left behind boots that Daniel never quite felt he could fill. And then he said 6 words that surprised even himself. "You're going back in there." And Blake did. He walked back into that diner, cheeks flushed, phone tucked away. He stood beside the booth, eyes low, and mumbled, "I'm sorry, sir." Walter looked up slowly, studied him for a long breath, and then said, "Next time, ask before you assume." Then he turned back to his coffee. But that wasn't the end of it. Because the next Sunday, Walter showed up at the diner, and Blake was already there, waiting. 2 mugs on the table. One for himself, one for the man he had once mocked. And from that day forward, the booth was never empty again. Walter didn't say anything about the apology. Not to the waitress. Not to the regulars. Not even to Blake, the boy who had offered it. He just sipped his coffee, the way he always did, quietly, like a man who understood the value of silence far better than noise. But something had shifted. The regulars noticed it first. The way Walter paused an extra second when the bell above the diner door jingled. The way he glanced up when Blake and his father returned a week later, this time without phones, without the smug laughter, without the arrogance of assumed superiority. And it wasn't a grand gesture, not some movie moment where the old vet stood up and hugged the boy. It was smaller than that. More human. Walter nodded. Just once. And Blake, still a little unsure of himself, nodded back. That was enough. Blake didn't know why he had come back that second Sunday. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the way his father had looked at him afterward, quiet, disappointed, like he'd failed to pass something important down. But mostly, it was curiosity. That hat, the way the man carried himself, the silence that somehow said more than a lecture, that all haunted him. Because for the first time in his life, Blake had met someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. Walter had done it just by being still. And that was something Blake couldn't explain. Daniel Mercer had been different too. Ever since that day, something in him had cracked open. Some door he hadn't realized had been shut for decades. He'd gone home that night and pulled down a shoebox from the top of his closet. Inside, a photo of his grandfather in full uniform, a bronze star still pinned to the lapel, and a worn letter Daniel hadn't read in over 20 years. It started with, "To my grandson, who will never know war but must learn how to fight for peace." Daniel read it twice. Then he started showing up at the diner with Blake every Sunday, not just to support his son, but to relearn what he'd forgotten. The third week, Walter spoke first. "You always get here this early, or just trying to impress me?" he asked, eyes fixed on his notebook. Blake grinned, trying to play it cool. "Early bird gets the eggs." Walter didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something. "Early bird gets shot first," he muttered, then looked up. "Unless he knows how to fly low." That was how it began. Slow. Deliberate. A conversation measured in fragments. Walter didn't open up easily, not because he didn't want to, but because decades of survival had taught him that the loudest people were often the ones who listened the least. But Blake was different now. He listened. He learned about Normandy. Not the version in textbooks, but the one that lived behind Walter's eyes. He learned about freezing nights, radios that didn't work, the smell of burning canvas, and the sound of a young man trying to hold in a scream because his commander was already dead. Walter didn't give details for shock value. He offered them like parables, half-wrapped truths that revealed more about courage than carnage. Blake took notes. Actual notes. Daniel noticed, but didn't say anything. He just watched, heart cracking and healing all at once. By week 5, they had a routine. Blake brought Walter a folded newspaper. Daniel brought Walter's favorite cherry Danish. Walter brought his silence, which he offered like a gift. Occasionally, other patrons tried to join in, tried to ask Walter about the medals on his hat, or the photo that Blake now carried in his backpack. But Walter only responded to Blake. And that unspoken trust didn't go unnoticed. The waitress, Molly, had started saving their booth. She'd set it with 3 cups and an extra napkin folded like a triangle. No one asked her why. One Sunday, a younger man in a polo shirt set a few booths down, watching with the kind of arrogance that was all too familiar. As they left, he smirked and said loud enough to be heard, "Man's probably just telling war stories to get a free breakfast." Blake bristled, turning red. But Walter didn't stop walking. He just said, softly, "The ones who talk the most about bravery usually haven't earned it." Blake didn't respond until they were outside. Then he said, "You ever get tired of being ignored?" Walter shrugged. "Not my job to be seen. It's my job to see." That night, Blake went home and asked his father if they could find out more about Walter's service. Not to verify him, but to understand just how much the world had forgotten. Daniel made a few calls. Reached out to an old friend at the veterans office. And what came back wasn't just a file. It was a history lesson wrapped in classified reports and hand-signed commendations. Operation Market Garden. Battle of the Bulge. Escape from a German POW camp. Commendation from General Ridgway himself. And at the bottom of the scan page, Walter Givens, Honorable Discharge, 1946. Status, missing from public record. How does a man like that go missing? Blake asked, stunned. Daniel sat back in his chair, eyes damp. Same way silence does. Slowly. And because no one listens. That following Sunday, they printed out the file, put it in a folder, and brought it to the diner. Blake handed it over like an offering. Walter stared at it for a long moment. "You went digging?" he asked. Blake nodded. "I wanted to know what kind of man I laughed at." Walter didn't smile, but he closed the folder and tapped it gently. Then I guess you're not laughing anymore. That was the day Walter invited them to his apartment. First time anyone had ever been. Blake stepped inside and froze. Framed pictures on the wall, a folded flag in a glass case, and above the mantel, the shadow box, still sealed. Walter walked over, opened it slowly, and let the years breathe. Metals lined with dust. A crinkled photograph of his original unit. And a letter, browned with time. Blake asked, "What's the letter say?" Walter handed it to him. It was from 1945, hand-signed. It read, "To Private Givens. You held your line when no one else did. You carried men when you could barely walk. We owe the river crossing to you. I won't forget that. Major General J.H. Ridgway." Blake stared at it like scripture. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Walter smiled faintly. "Because back then, men didn't talk about what they survived. They talked about who they lost." Outside the window, the Sunday sun slanted across the rooftops. Inside, a 95-year-old soldier sat beside a teenager who had once laughed at him. And neither said another word for a while, because some lessons are taught not in battle, but in the quiet after it. The last Sunday started like all the others, quiet light through the diner blinds, the low hum of coffee brewing, the faint sound of forks on plates, but something in the air felt heavier, more still. Walter wasn't at the booth. For the first time in months, the seat beside the windows sat empty. The mug sat untouched. The paper remained unfolded. Blake paced outside the front door, scanning the sidewalk like a search party of one, his hands twitching in the front pocket of his hoodie. Daniel stood a few feet behind him, cell phone in hand but no answers on screen. "He never misses Sundays," Blake said, voice tight with a worry that sounded much older than 17. Daniel nodded. "Let's go check on him." That was all they needed. The booth would have to wait. They knocked on Walter's apartment door for 5 minutes before the super finally opened it with a spare key. The apartment was dark but neat. Everything was where it always was, the folded flag, the hat on the coat rack, the shadow box above the fireplace. But there was no Walter. Just a note on the kitchen table, folded twice and scrawled in steady block letters, "Come to the American Legion Hall. 9 o'clock sharp. Bring the kid." No signature. None needed. Daniel looked at his son. "That's now." They drove across town in silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than music. The parking lot was full when they arrived. Not packed, but full of people who mattered. Veterans in full dress uniform. Others in modest slacks and polished shoes. Men and women who stood straighter than their bodies should have allowed, waiting in reverent formation outside the building. At the top of the steps stood Walter, his best shirt pressed, shoes gleaming, the 82nd Airborne hat perched carefully on his silver hair. He wasn't leaning on a cane. He wasn't sitting down. He stood tall, waiting. When Blake and Daniel stepped out of the car, something remarkable happened. The line of veterans, all strangers to them, parted. Quietly, wordlessly, like a gate opening not for rank, but for respect. Blake's steps faltered. Daniel gently placed a hand on his back. "Go." Walter nodded when Blake approached. "You said you wanted to know the rest," he said simply. "Thought you ought to hear it from someone other than me." Inside, the American Legion Hall had been transformed. Not with decorations or flags. With presence. Over 30 veterans from 4 wars, most in uniform, some in wheelchairs, all facing forward toward a small table on a raised platform. On it sat a single framed photo, Walter in 1944, muddy and unshaven, gripping a rifle beside 2 fellow soldiers who never came home. The table also held the shadow box. Open. Its contents spread carefully, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. Beside it, a copy of the letter from General Ridgway. Walter stepped up to the podium, not to give a speech, but to hand something over. He held out a folder to Blake. "This," he said quietly, "is my service record. I want you to keep it." Blake looked at it like it was a flame he didn't know how to hold. "Why me?" he whispered. Walter looked around the room. "Because someone needs to carry the truth forward. Not the medals. The meaning. The reason we wore them. And because you made a mistake, but you came back. That counts." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, but no one wept loudly. They held it in, like the generation that had raised them taught them to. A quiet kind of grief. A quiet kind of pride. Blake opened the folder and read the first line aloud. Private Walter Givens, enlisted 1943, active duty. 1944 to 1946, theater, Europe, unit, 82nd Airborne, commendation. Acts of gallantry beyond the call of duty. One of the veterans, an older woman in full Navy dress, stood slowly and saluted. "With permission, sir," she said to Walter, "I think it's time we made this official." She turned to Blake and, in the formal cadence of ceremony, said, "Young man, for your humility, for your commitment to learn, and for your willingness to honor what you once disrespected, we present to you a symbol of that legacy." She handed Blake a folded flag, the same one from Walter's mantle. "May you carry it with the weight it deserves." Blake tried to speak but couldn't. He simply bowed his head, eyes burning. Walter walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to earn the right to honor someone," he said. "You just have to be willing to carry the memory properly." That night, the town changed. It didn't make the papers. No reporters showed up. But word spread. About the teenager who laughed and came back. About the old man who forgave him. About the father who realized that honor is something you pass down, not just salute. The next Sunday, Walter didn't come to the diner. But the booth wasn't empty. Blake sat alone, 2 mugs on the table. One for him, one untouched, facing the window. The waitress set down the cherry Danish without a word and placed the flag, now in a glass triangle, beside the second cup. "On the house," she whispered. Blake nodded. He reached into his backpack and pulled out Walter's notebook. It was filled with blank pages. He began to write. He walked into a diner to laugh at a man he didn't understand. He left carrying that man's story. Walter Givens didn't need a parade. He didn't ask for respect. But by the time he was gone, he'd left behind something louder than applause, a legacy written in silence, and carried forward by the very hand that once mocked it.